In 1925, 14,000 of the 17,000 industrial workers in Altoona, Pennsylvania, worked for a single employer. Not a majority, not a plurality, 82%. The Pennsylvania Railroad didn't just dominate Altoona. It was Altoona in a way that no single company has ever been any other American city. And the strangest part of the story is that the city itself was the company's idea. Altoona didn't attract the railroad. The railroad invented Altoona, set it down in a valley at the base of a mountain range in 1849, and for the better part of a century ran it like a company town because that's exactly what it was. The problem that created Altoona was geological. The Allegheny Mountains sliced across central Pennsylvania like a wall, and if you were trying to move freight or passengers between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, that wall was in your way. For decades, the state had tried to solve this with the main line of public works, a fantastically clumsy system of canals and inclined planes that hoisted canal boats over the mountains on primitive rail cars powered by stationary steam engines. It worked, barely. A trip from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh took 4 days when the canals weren't frozen, which they were for months at a time. The Erie Canal up in New York, finished in 1825, was already siphoning trade away from Philadelphia and feeding it to New York City. Pennsylvania was losing the commercial race, and everyone who mattered in Philadelphia knew it. The Pennsylvania Railroad was chartered on April 13, 1846, with a mandate to build an all-rail line across the state. The man who would solve the mountain problem was John Edgar Thomson, the railroad's chief engineer and later its president, a man who deserves more recognition than American history has given him. Thomson was methodical, visionary, and relentless. He surveyed the routes himself. He studied the grades. And he concluded that the only way to get a loaded train over the Allegheny escarpment at a grade a locomotive could actually handle was to swing the tracks in an enormous horseshoe-shaped arc around the face of a mountain at a place called Katanning Point, about 5 miles west of a settlement that didn't yet exist. That settlement would become Altoona. The railroad purchased 224 acres in Logan Valley in 1849, reportedly for $10,000, and began laying out a town grid. The name's origin is contested. Some say it derives from a Cherokee word meaning high lands of great worth. Others credit a civil engineer named Colonel Beverly Mayer, who named it after the city of Altoona in Holstein, which is now a district of Hamburg. Nobody settled the argument. What everyone agrees on is that the town was built to serve the railroad, and the railroad wasted no time building the infrastructure to prove it. By 1850, tracks reached Altoona from Harrisburg, and the first shop building went up, a long structure on 12th Street housing a machine shop, a woodworking shop, a blacksmith shop, a locomotive repair facility, and a foundry, all under one roof. It was functional rather than grand, but it was the seed of what would become the largest railroad shop complex in the world. And here's where the Horseshoe Curve enters the story, because everything that Altoona would become depended on that curve getting built. Thomson hired roughly 450 laborers, most of them Irish immigrants from counties Cork, Mayo, and Antrim, who lived in camps strung along the route and worked with nothing but picks, shovels, horses, and drag carts. They cut away the face of a mountain to form a ledge. They hauled the excavated rock and earth to fill 2 deep ravines on either side. They did this for 3 years, in summers that baked the exposed mountainside and winters that froze the ground solid. They were paid 25 cents an hour for 12-hour days. The line between Altoona and Johnstown, 31 miles of track including the Horseshoe Curve, opened on February 15, 1854. The total cost was $2.5 million, about $80,000 per mile. Translated into today's money, that's roughly $89 million for the whole stretch, and it changed everything. Travel time between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh dropped from 4 days to 15 hours. The one-way fare fell from $9.50 to $8. The old Portage Railroad, with its 10 inclined planes and its mule teams, was instantly obsolete. Thomson's Pennsylvania Railroad bought it out by 1857 and stripped it for parts. The Horseshoe Curve itself was an astonishing piece of engineering, 2,375 feet long, with a central angle of 220 degrees, climbing a grade of 1.8%. A train entering from the east rose 122 feet by the time it exited to the west. It was, in its era, mentioned alongside the Panama Canal and the Brooklyn Bridge as one of the engineering wonders of the world, and it put Altoona on the map. Or rather, it made Altoona the map. Every westbound train had to climb through that curve, and before it climbed, it stopped in Altoona. Locomotives needed servicing, crews needed changing, helper engines needed attaching. The little company town at the base of the mountains was now the bottleneck through which the entire east-west commerce of the Pennsylvania Railroad had to pass. The railroad understood what it had, and it built accordingly. In 1852, the same year the first trains ran all the way from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, the PRR began constructing the Logan House, a massive hotel right beside the tracks. Thomas Burchinell, a railroad carpenter foreman, oversaw a crew of 75 men who completed the 106-room, 4-story hotel the following year. It stretched more than 200 feet along the tracks. An 1855 railroad travelogue called it better than any in Europe and equal to any in America, which was promotional enthusiasm, certainly. But the Logan House was genuinely impressive. 3 large parlors, a dining room where a head waiter appeared on the veranda and struck a Chinese gong when passenger trains arrived, summoning riders inside, 20 minutes for lunch and not a second more. One humorist who stayed there quipped that the place was about the size of Rhode Island. The Logan House was also where American history quietly pivoted. On September 24th and 25th, 1862, with the Civil War going badly for the Union and Abraham Lincoln desperate for political support, 13 governors of northern states gathered at the hotel for what became known as the Loyal War Governors Conference. Pennsylvania's Governor Andrew Gregg Curtin had sent a telegram invitation on September 6th, calling the governors to meet at a point in the border states. Altoona was that point, central, accessible by rail, and controlled by a railroad whose president, John Edgar Thomson, was sympathetic to the Union cause. The day before the meeting began, Thomson treated the arriving governors to a sightseeing trip to the Horseshoe Curve. The next morning, they sat down in the Logan House and gave Lincoln what he needed, a vote of confidence and a promise of support for the Emancipation Proclamation, which he had issued just 2 days earlier. No reporters were present. There was almost no press coverage afterward. The Altoona Mirror, looking back on its 50th anniversary, would call it the event that, more than any other thing, strengthened Lincoln's hands in the darkest hour of the war period. The governors also recommended removing General George McClellan from command of the Army of the Potomac. They got that too. Think about that for a moment. A meeting that helped secure the political foundation for the Emancipation Proclamation happened in a railroad hotel, in a company town that was 13 years old, because the railroad's tracks happened to pass through it. That's Altoona in miniature, a place where enormous national consequences occurred almost incidentally, because the trains stopped there. The Civil War itself was good for Altoona in the grim arithmetic of wartime industry. The Union needed locomotives, and Altoona's shops provided them. By the end of the war, the works employed over 1,000 people, up from a few hundred at the start. The town was incorporated as a borough in 1854 and as a city in 1868. Its population was roughly 2,000 in 1854. By 1870, it was 10,000. By 1880, 20,000. Immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and Italy arrived in waves, drawn by the steady wages the railroad offered. The railroad shaped everything. It built housing for workers and executives, established a fire department, moved the hospital closer to the shop gates, sponsored a library, the Mechanics' Library, founded in 1853, which still exists today as the Altoona Area Public Library, and laid out the streetcar lines that connected the neighborhoods, and the shops kept growing. In 1866, the Altoona Works produced its first complete locomotive, marking the transition from a facility that merely repaired engines to one that built them from scratch. In 1869, the Altoona car shops opened about a mile east along the main line, primarily for building and repairing freight and passenger cars. In 1875, the works started a testing department that would lead the nation in research and testing procedures for the railroad industry. In 1877, telephone lines were installed so the various shop departments could communicate with one another. This was only a year after Alexander Graham Bell's patent. In 1888, construction began on the Juniata locomotive shops, a mile northeast of the original site, which would become the primary engine-building facility. The Juniata shops were completed in 1890 and expanded significantly in 1924 and 1925. By the turn of the century, the numbers were staggering. The Pennsylvania Railroad carried about 150,000 passengers in 1854. By 1890, the figure was 20 million. Freight tonnage went from 157,000 tons in 1853 to 67 million tons by 1900, a 400-fold increase, and all of it flowed through Altoona. The shops sprawled across 218 acres, with 122 buildings containing 88 acres of floor space under roof. They held 4,500 machine tools and 94 overhead cranes. The East Altoona Roundhouse, built in 1904, had 50 stalls and measured 395 feet in diameter, the largest roundhouse in the world. At its peak, it serviced 325 to 350 steam locomotives daily and employed about 1,200 people just in that one building. The human scale of all this is hard to convey. Walking through the Altoona Works in its prime would have overwhelmed the senses. The roar of the forge shops, the rhythmic hammering from the erecting bays where locomotives were assembled, the hiss of steam from engines being tested, the smell of burning coal, hot iron, and machine oil thickening the air until you could almost chew it. Blacksmiths, machinists, boilermakers, foundry workers, pattern makers, electricians, carpenters, painters, sheet metal workers. Each trade had its own building, its own hierarchy, its own culture, its own internal pride. The workforce was organized along ethnic lines that nobody talked about openly, but everyone understood. English, Welsh, Scottish, and German workers got the supervisory and foreman positions. Italians and Eastern Europeans were largely confined to common laboring jobs. Despite this, or perhaps because the single employer kept a firm hand on labor relations, union agitation was minimal compared to other industrial cities. During the great railroad strikes of 1877, which erupted into violence in Pittsburgh, work at the Altoona shops was disrupted but not stopped. Between 1866 and 1946, the Altoona Works built 6,873 locomotives, steam, diesel electric, and electric. They also built over 16,000 freight cars between 1921 and 1940 alone, plus thousands of passenger cars, including some of the nation's first all-steel passenger cars. The PRR's flagship passenger locomotive, the K4S Pacific, was engineered in Altoona in 1914. It became the standard for American passenger power for decades. The shops didn't just build and repair, they innovated. In 1905, a stationary locomotive testing plant was installed, originally displayed at the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, and it allowed engineers to extract precise performance data from locomotives running at full power while standing still. Altoona's testing plant was the most sophisticated facility of its kind in the world. And the city that grew around all this was not just a collection of row houses and shift whistles. By the early 1900s, Altoona had become a genuine small city with ambitions that exceeded its industrial function. The population more than doubled between 1900 and 1930, rising from 39,000 to an all-time peak of 82,000. 11th Avenue emerged as the commercial spine, macadamized in 1873, paved with asphalt blocks in 1889, and fitted with the city's first trolley tracks in 1882. By the 1890s, the avenue was lined with large red brick commercial blocks that gave it a downtown dignity unusual for a city its size. William F. Gable opened a single-room store on 11th Avenue on March 1, 1884. By 1891, he'd built a Victorian neoclassical building on the site. By 1913, Gable's was considered the most complete department store in Pennsylvania, known as the People's Store. People who remember it, and some still do, describe the crowds on 11th Avenue like a conveyor belt. You came out of the store and had to wait for a gap in the foot traffic to step onto the sidewalk. The Gable family didn't just sell goods. They bought a radio station in 1923 and renamed it WFBG after the founder. They launched a television station in 1952, WFBG-TV, whose first broadcast was March 1, 1953. That station still operates today as WTAJ. A department store family built the media infrastructure of a city. That's how intertwined everything was. Then there was the Mishler Theater. Isaac Charles Mishler, everyone called him Doc, was born in Lancaster in 1862 and had been running the 11th Avenue Opera House before he decided Altoona deserved something grander. He hired architect Albert E. Westover to design a Beaux-Arts theater at 1208 12th Avenue, and he financed the entire project himself. The Mishler Theater opened on February 15, 1906, with seating for nearly 2,000. In his inaugural program, Mishler wrote that the policy of the theater was to present high-class standard productions in a perfect manner to audiences safely housed in comfort and pleasing surroundings. The building featured an air conditioning system that was ingeniously primitive, blocks of ice placed beneath the auditorium that ventilated cool air through the floor. The exterior was a Beaux-Arts confection, with statues of the muses Terpsichore and Melpomene flanking the upper stories and ornate poster display windows on either side of the entrance. 9 months after it opened, a fire in the neighboring Rothert building spread to the theater and destroyed the interior. Mishler rebuilt. The theater reopened in 1907. It was for decades the cultural anchor of downtown Altoona. Vaudeville, traveling theater companies, silent films, talkies, the whole arc of American popular entertainment running through a single building in a railroad town in the Alleghenies. Mishler retired in 1924 and sold the theater in 1931. That sale marked something, the moment when the man who had built a cultural landmark concluded that the city's trajectory was no longer pointing upward. But before the decline, one more burst of ambition. In the 1920s, Altoona's newly formed Chamber of Commerce looked at the city's economy, 82% dependent on a single employer, and recognized the vulnerability. Their solution was a grand hotel, one that could attract convention business and begin diversifying the city's economic base. The Penn Alto Hotel opened in 1921, 9 stories tall with a partial 10th-floor penthouse, designed by the George H. Stevens Company of Chicago, a design-build firm that had put up similar hotels in Cleveland, Des Moines, and other cities. It was financed through private subscriptions, local businessmen writing checks to will a new future into existence. 300 rooms, an air-conditioned coffee shop, a cocktail lounge, a stag bar. It was, according to the Library of Congress's own assessment, the single building that, perhaps better than any other, symbolized the civic spirit of the 1920s in downtown Altoona. That same decade saw the Jaffa Shrine Center rise on Broad Avenue, a building that looks, even today, like someone transported a golden brick Middle Eastern fortress to central Pennsylvania. Designed by local architects Frank A. Hirsch and Frederick James Schaller, who were popular in Altoona between 1904 and 1930, the Shrine Center was built between 1928 and 1930 and opened on September 25, 1930. It measured 216 feet by 206 feet, occupied an entire city block, and enclosed an acre of space under one roof. Its minarets were patterned after those on the tomb of Sufdar Jung near Delhi, India. The cornerstone came from King Solomon's quarry in Jerusalem. Arabic inscriptions from Proverbs ran above the stage in the front entrance. The auditorium seated up to 5,000 for concerts and boxing. It was and remains one of the most improbable buildings in any American city of comparable size, and it exists because Altoona in the late 1920s was a city that believed it deserved monuments. Also in 1928, the Altoona Symphony Orchestra was founded. Also in the 1920s, the Altoona Speedway, a 1.25-mile wooden board track, was hosting automobile races that drew national attention and national tragedy. 3 Indianapolis 500 winners died in crashes there. Howdy Wilcox, the 1919 winner, on September 4th, 1923. Joe Boyer, the 1924 winner, on September 2nd, 1924. And Ray Keach, the 1929 winner, on June 15th, 1929, just 2 weeks after his Indy victory. The Speedway closed in 1931. The deaths were sensational news, but the closing was barely noticed. By 1931, people in Altoona had other things to worry about. The population had peaked at 82,000 in 1930. It would never reach that number again. The decline didn't arrive as a single blow. It accumulated. On Christmas 1931, a devastating fire destroyed the air brake shop, machine shop, paint shop, and wheel shop at the Altoona Works. The Depression had begun, and the buildings were never rebuilt. That's worth pausing on, not the fire itself, which was the kind of industrial accident that happened everywhere, but the decision not to rebuild. In a different economic moment, those shops would have been back up within a year. Instead, the footprint of the works began to shrink, and it never stopped shrinking. But before the long contraction, one more moment in the spotlight. During World War II, the Horseshoe Curve became a target of Nazi Germany. In June 1942, 8 German saboteurs trained by the Abwehr were landed on the American coast by U-boat. 4 at Amagansett, Long Island, and 4 at Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida, as part of Operation Pastorius, named with heavy irony after the German founder of Germantown, Pennsylvania. Their target list included factories, power plants, and critical rail infrastructure, with the Horseshoe Curve near the top. A historian at Penn State Altoona later noted that striking the curve would have been akin to hitting the Empire State Building, not just a physical blow, but a psychological one, designed to make Americans question whether their government could protect them. The saboteurs never reached Altoona. 2 of them, apparently lacking conviction or losing their nerve, contacted the FBI. All 8 were captured, tried by military tribunal on orders from President Roosevelt, and 6 were executed. But the fact that Hitler's war planners had identified Altoona as a strategic target tells you something about what the city meant to the national infrastructure in 1942. The Horseshoe Curve carried troops, steel, medicine, and munitions. Destroy it, and you delay the war effort across the entire eastern seaboard. The war itself was the Altoona Works' final great performance. The demands of wartime transportation pushed the shops to their limits. The Juniata shops reached their peak locomotive output in 1943, with 111 new locomotives completed in a single year. A new turntable with a 110-foot beam was installed in 1942 to accommodate the largest locomotives the shops had ever built, including the T1 class, the last steam locomotive design produced at Altoona, recognizable by its distinctive shark nose appearance. The workers delivered. They always delivered. And then the economics shifted underneath them. Diesel locomotives had been entering service since the 1930s, and by the late 1940s, the verdict was in. Diesel engines could run farther between maintenance stops, needed smaller crews, cost less to fuel, and required a fraction of the shop infrastructure that steam demanded. The massive, complex craft skills that had defined Altoona, the boiler making, the precision valve work, the 1,000 arcane repairs that kept a steam locomotive running were becoming obsolete. The math was brutal and simple. In 1953, the Pennsylvania Railroad announced that the steam locomotive program would be abolished by the end of December. Steam work at the Juniata shops lingered for a few more years, but by 1957 it was finished. The Logan House, that grand railroad hotel where the war governors had met, and where a head waiter had struck a Chinese gong to summon passengers to lunch, had already closed on June 30th, 1927. The property was sold to the federal government in 1931, and a neoclassical post office was built on the site. Today, a historical marker stands where the veranda once overlooked the tracks. If you stand at the corner of 11th Avenue and 13th Street and try to imagine the scene, governors arriving, crowds gathering on the train platform, locomotives hissing steam, you're standing in front of a post office. The Penn Central merger of 1968 was supposed to be a salvation. The Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central Railroad, 2 of the mightiest names in American transportation, combined to form what should have been an unassailable colossus. Instead, it became one of the most catastrophic corporate failures in American business history. The 2 railroads had incompatible corporate cultures. The Pennsy was traditional and conservative. The Central had been streamlined under Alfred Perlman's younger management team. The Red Team and the Green Team, as insiders called them, fought over everything. Freight cars were lost, switch yards jammed, service deteriorated. In its first year, Penn Central posted a modest loss of $2.8 million. In 1969, losses ballooned to $83 million. In 1970, the deficit hit $325.8 million. The Nixon administration contemplated a $200 million bailout through the Defense Production Act, essentially raiding Navy funds, followed by a $750 million General Railroad rescue. Congress refused. On June 21, 1970, Penn Central filed for bankruptcy, at the time the largest bankruptcy in American history. The nation's sixth largest corporation, controlling more than 20,000 miles of track and 1/8 of the nation's freight, had imploded in 2.5 years. For Altoona, the bankruptcy was not so much a catastrophe as a confirmation. The decline had been underway for 20 years. Employment at the shops had been falling steadily since the end of the war. The Penn Central bankruptcy accelerated what was already happening: consolidation, layoffs, the transfer of work to other facilities or to contractors. The wreckage was eventually reorganized into Conrail in 1976, a government-owned freight railroad that merged all the failing northeastern lines. Conrail kept the Altoona shops open for diesel locomotive repair, but employment kept dropping. The city's commercial life contracted in parallel. Gable's department store, the People's Store, the place where you had to wait for a gap in the sidewalk crowds to step out the door. It closed in 1980, after nearly a century in business. The building survives. It's office space now. The crowds on 11th Avenue thinned. Other stores followed Gable's into memory. The Station Mall was built during the 1970s on the site of old railroad shops, an attempt to create a modern retail anchor downtown, trading industrial heritage for consumer convenience. It became the Station Medical Center, which tells you how that worked out. The Mishler Theater, the Beaux-Arts jewel that Doc Mishler had financed out of his own pocket, was considered for demolition in 1965 to make room for a parking lot. A parking lot. A building designed to house the Muses with statues of Terpsichore and Melpomene on its facade was almost razed to store cars. The Altoona Community Theater and the Blair County Arts Foundation purchased it and began renovations. It reopened in 1969 with a production of The Sound of Music. A new chandelier was bought in 1970 at a Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer auction, a Hollywood artifact lighting a vaudeville stage in a railroad town. Major structural work continued into the 1990s. The Mishler Theater still operates today. It hosts the Altoona Symphony Orchestra, the Allegheny Ballet Company, the Blair Concert Chorale. It is perhaps the single greatest preservation victory in the city's history, and it was won by a margin of inches. The Penn Alto Hotel, that 9-story monument to civic optimism, financed by private subscriptions from businessmen who wanted to diversify the local economy, followed a different path. It transitioned from a hotel to a residential hotel, then to apartments. Its name changed to City Hall Commons, a name that carries none of the ambition of the original. It stands across the street from City Hall, a building also designed by Hirsch and Schaller, the same architects who designed the Jaffa Shrine. The Penn Alto is on the National Register of Historic Places. It has not been demolished, but it is no longer what it was built to be. The population numbers tell the story in their own blunt language: 82,000 in 1930. Then the curve bends downward, and it doesn't stop. The 1940 census shows a slight decline. The 1950 census, another drop. By 1960, the city was below 70,000. By 1970, below 63,000. By 1990, 52,000. By 2000, 49,000. By 2020, 44,000. That's a loss of nearly half the city's population over 90 years, each decade a little thinner than the last. Each census a subtraction that nobody can quite explain with a single cause, because there isn't one. The railroad shrank. The highways came. Interstate 99 eventually provided the automobile-scale connectivity that made the railroad centrality less important. Retail migrated to the suburbs, to the Logan Valley Mall, to the strip along Pleasant Valley Boulevard. The young people who grew up in Altoona found their careers elsewhere, the way young people in 1,000 small American cities did. In 1999, Conrail was divided between CSX Transportation and Norfolk Southern, with Norfolk Southern acquiring the Horseshoe Curve and the Juniata shops. As of recent years, the shops employed roughly 450 people, about the same number who had worked there in 1855, before Altoona had truly become Altoona. The workforce had traveled a complete circle, from a few hundred to nearly 19,000 and back to a few hundred over the course of 170 years. But the Horseshoe Curve still carries trains. That's worth emphasizing because so much of the Altoona story ends in closure or demolition or repurposing, and the curve does not. Norfolk Southern's freight trains round it 50 to 80 times a day, depending on traffic. Helper engines still push heavy trains up the grade and help brake them coming down, just as they did in 1854. Amtrak's Pennsylvanian passes through once daily in each direction, connecting Pittsburgh and New York. Annual traffic through the curve has been measured at over 111 million short tons. The engineering solution that John Edgar Thomson devised in the early 1850s, using Irish laborers with picks and shovels, has never been improved upon. The alignment is the original alignment. The grade is the original grade. Everything else in Altoona has changed around it, but the curve remains, doing exactly what it was designed to do, carrying the weight. The city today is not empty. 44,000 people live there, and the metropolitan area holds over 120,000. The economy has pivoted, as the consultants would say. Healthcare is now the leading employer. UPMC Altoona, the VA Medical Center, nursing homes, and assisted living facilities. Sheetz, the convenience store chain, is headquartered in Altoona. Bob Sheetz founded the first store in 1952, and the company now operates more than 800 locations across the Mid-Atlantic. Penn State Altoona, founded in 1939, enrolls several thousand students and has been buying downtown buildings and converting them into campus facilities. The DeVoris Downtown Center, the Sheetz Center for Entrepreneurial Excellence, pumping some investment back into the core. Boyer Candy Company, makers of the Mallow Cup, has been in Altoona since 1936. Lakemont Park has the Leap the Dips, the world's oldest wooden roller coaster, built in 1902, though it hasn't operated since 2024. And the landmarks endure, some of them. The Jaffa Shrine Center, with its minarets patterned after an Indian tomb and its cornerstone from Jerusalem, was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2025 and is pursuing tax-deductible status to fund preservation. The Mishler Theater stands at 1208 12th Avenue, its Beaux-Arts facade intact, its programming active. The Cathedral of the Blessed Sacrament anchors the corner of 13th Street and 13th Avenue, seat of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Altoona-Johnstown since 1851. The Penn Alto building watches over City Hall from across the street. The Railroaders Memorial Museum, housed in the former PRR Master Mechanics building, tells the story of the workers, not just the executives, not just the engineers, but the boilermakers and blacksmiths and laborers who built 6,873 locomotives and tens of thousands of freight and passenger cars over 80 years. The Altoona Mirror, founded in 1876 by Harry Slepp, still publishes. Daily circulation of 32,000, Sunday circulation of 39,000. It's the oldest media outlet in the city, and it's still telling the story, decade after decade, even as the story has fewer characters and quieter scenes. One detail from the downtown's history sticks with me. When 11th Avenue was at its peak, the 1920s, let's say, with Gable's drawing shoppers and the Penn Alto Hotel drawing conventioneers and the trolley tracks running down the center of the pavement, the avenue was one of the first streets in Altoona to be paved, first with macadam in 1873, then with asphalt blocks in 1889. It received the city's first trolley line in 1882. Every upgrade came because the avenue was where the money was, where the foot traffic was, where the railroad's passenger station channeled visitors into the commercial district. The street was a product of the railroad's gravity, the same way the city was. And when the gravity weakened, the street thinned out, not all at once, but store by store, year by year, until the gaps between the storefronts became the dominant feature of the block. There's a particular quality to Altoona that distinguishes it from other railroad towns, other Rust Belt cities, other places where an industry rose and fell and left a population stranded. It's the specificity of the dependency. Altoona wasn't a city that happened to have a big railroad employer. It was a city that existed because of, and only because of, the railroad. The PRR didn't move to Altoona. It made Altoona. It laid out the streets, built the hotel, dug the foundations, recruited the workers, and created the economy from scratch. When the railroad contracted, there was no prior identity to fall back on, no agricultural base, no port, no river trade, no pre-existing town that had been there before the trains came. The thing that had made the place real was the thing that was leaving, and yet the place didn't vanish. 44,000 people still get up in the morning in Altoona, Pennsylvania. They drive past the Jaffa Shrine with its golden brick and its incongruous minarets. They pass the Gables Building, which is office space now but still stands at the intersection of 14th Street and 11th Avenue. They might catch a game at People's Natural Gas Field, where the Altoona Curve, named of course for the Horseshoe Curve, play as a AA affiliate of the Pittsburgh Pirates. They shop at the Logan Valley Mall or along Pleasant Valley Boulevard, or they don't shop much at all because the median household income is $46,000, and the city ranks in the bottom 2% for population growth among cities its size. The Horseshoe Curve, 5 miles west of town, is quiet between trains. The visitor center sells souvenirs. A funicular carries people up the hillside, or you can climb 194 steps to the trackside observation area, the same park that was first built in 1879. The first park in America built specifically for watching trains. When a Norfolk Southern freight rounds the bend, the ground shakes slightly, and the locomotives lean into the curve the way they've been leaning into it for 172 years. And for a moment, the engineering is the only story, and it's a perfect one. Then the train passes, and the sound fades into the mountains, and the curve is empty again, waiting.